December 29th, 1944. 23:40 hours. Mindoro Island, northern Philippines. The night was pitch black. No moon, no stars. Just a thin green glow from the P-61 Black Widow's instrument panel washing over Major Carroll C. Smith's face. At 26 years old, he looked like a man who'd aged decades in the dark. Inside the cramped cockpit at McGuire Field, Smith listened to his radar operator call out a contact moving at 180 knots through the void north of the Philippines. 12 Japanese bombers were coming, and he was the only thing in the sky that could stop them. Smith had flown 43 combat missions. He had 4 kills. None of that mattered tonight. The math was merciless. 1 night fighter, 12 bombers. If he intercepted one, 11 would slip through and strike the airfields below, where 20,000 Americans slept in tents, where engineers worked under floodlights, where 2 unfinished runways would decide whether the coming invasion of Lingayen Gulf lived or died. For 2 weeks, the Japanese had hammered Mindoro every single night. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days. Wave after wave of bombers, kamikazes, anything that could carry explosives. The enemy understood what those airfields meant. If American fighters could operate from Mindoro, they could provide air cover for the entire invasion fleet. The Japanese had to stop construction. They sent everything they had. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at McGuire Field 3 days earlier, on December 26th. Smith's squadron was the only thing standing between those bombers and the men sleeping below. The pressure was suffocating. Every bomber that penetrated the defenses meant dead engineers, delayed airfields, postponed invasion, mounting casualties at Lingayen Gulf. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow was the first American aircraft designed specifically to kill in darkness. Twin-boom configuration, 66-foot wingspan, 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines producing 2,000 horsepower each. Maximum speed, 366 miles per hour. Rate of climb, 2,090 feet per minute. 4 20mm Hispano M2 cannons mounted in the lower fuselage, each loaded with 200 rounds. But the cannons weren't the real weapon. The SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese had no idea it existed. Their bombers flew at night because they believed darkness made them invisible. They were wrong. Lieutenant Porter sat behind Smith in a separate compartment, hunched over a glowing radar scope, tracking every aircraft within range. Porter had been reading radar returns for 6 months. He knew how to separate friendly aircraft from enemy bombers, how to vector Smith toward contacts, how to predict target movement. Tonight, he was tracking 12 separate contacts, all heading south toward Mindoro, all at different altitudes. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R2800 engines responded instantly, a deep-throated roar that vibrated through the airframe. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute. Porter called out vectors, heading 035, altitude 8,000, range 4 miles. Smith couldn't see anything through the canopy, just blackness, no horizon, no visual references. Heavy clouds obscured everything. This is why the Japanese chose tonight. Complete darkness meant their bombers were invisible to conventional fighters. But Smith wasn't flying a conventional fighter. The SCR-720 radar used a rotating parabolic dish mounted in the nose, sending out microwave pulses at 180 degrees forward. When those pulses hit an aircraft, they bounced back. Porter's scope showed the return as a glowing blip. Two displays, one showing azimuth, one showing elevation. Porter watched both simultaneously, guiding Smith with verbal corrections. Left 5 degrees, down 3. Range 3 miles. Smith activated his own radar scope, a smaller display integrated into the main instrument panel. When the target got close enough, he could track it himself without relying on Porter's instructions. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M. The Americans called it Betty. Twin Mitsubishi Kase engines, maximum speed 270 miles per hour, crew of 7, bomb load 1,760 pounds. The Betty had one critical weakness: no self-sealing fuel tanks. One burst from Smith's 20mm cannons would turn the bomber into a fireball. Range 2 miles. Smith could see the target on his scope now. The blip was steady. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was behind them. Japanese bombers had no tail warning radar, no way to detect a pursuing night fighter. They flew in darkness, believing they were safe. The P-61 made that assumption fatal. Smith closed to 1,000 yards, still couldn't see the Betty visually. The darkness was absolute. He relied entirely on the radar scope. 800 yards, 700, 600. At 500 yards, Smith finally saw it, a dark shape against slightly darker clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames were barely visible, faint orange glows from the engine nacelles. Smith moved the P-61 into position, slightly below the bomber, slightly behind. The four 20mm Hispano M2 cannons were mounted in the lower fuselage, fixed forward. Smith had to aim the entire aircraft. He used the N6 gun sight integrated into his instrument panel, adjusting position until the bomber sat centered in the illuminated reticle. Range 400 yards. Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon carried 200 rounds, 800 rounds total, enough for approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine called for short, concentrated bursts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill, move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds for the remaining targets. Smith squeezed the trigger at 350 yards. The four cannons fired in unison. The sound was deafening, even through the engine noise. 20mm high-explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers looked like red lines drawn across the darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds. 12 rounds per cannon. 48 rounds total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water 8 miles north of Mindoro at 23:57 hours. For 2 seconds, the sky went quiet. Just the engines humming and the smell of hot gun barrels filling the cockpit. 1 bomber down, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned through 15% of his fuel, and 3 more contacts were still on Porter's scope, all heading toward Mindoro, all separated by miles of black sky. And Smith had exactly 112 minutes of fuel remaining. Then everything accelerated. Porter identified the second target at 0014 hours on December 30th. Heading 180. Altitude 6,000 feet. Range 6 miles. Smith turned the P-61 south and descended. The problem was geometry. The second bomber was 23 miles from the first kill. At Smith's cruise speed of 280 miles per hour, that meant approximately 5 minutes to intercept. 5 minutes the bomber spent flying closer to Mindoro, closer to the airfields, closer to completing its mission. Smith pushed the Black Widow faster. 320 miles per hour. The R-2800 engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate at high power settings. Every minute at maximum speed cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. But if he didn't intercept the bomber quickly, American anti-aircraft gunners would open fire. The bomber might get shot down, or it might release its bombs. Either way, Smith would have failed. Porter called out corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact grew stronger on the radar scope. Range, 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith spotted the bomber at 1 mile. Another Betty. Same profile. Same vulnerable fuel tanks. The bomber was lower than the first one, 6,000 feet instead of 8,000, closer to the cloud layer. That gave Smith less room to maneuver. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the target, but Smith couldn't shake the feeling that the next bomber wouldn't die as easily as the first one. The approach had to be perfect. Too fast and he'd overshoot. Too slow and the bomber might spot him. Night fighters relied on surprise. Once the enemy knew you were there, everything changed. At 500 yards, Smith saw the Betty clearly. Dark shape against dark sky. The bomber crew was flying straight and level. No evasive maneuvers, no indication they knew Smith was there. The P-61's black paint made it nearly invisible at night. The engines were quiet compared to most fighters. The Japanese called the P-61 the Black Widow. They feared it. But fear only worked if they knew it was coming. Smith centered the target in his gun sight. Range, 350 yards. He fired. 2-second burst. 48 rounds. The shells tore through the Betty's fuselage. The right engine caught fire immediately, then the left. Both wings were burning within seconds. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall. It hit the water at 0019 hours. 17 minutes after midnight. 2 bombers down. 10 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 42% remaining. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope. Both were closer to Mindoro than the previous targets. Both were at different altitudes. One at 9,000 feet, one at 4,000 feet. And they were 8 miles apart. Smith made a decision that would define the rest of the night. If you're still flying with me, hit like and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is there, or if anyone in your family served in World War II. I read every story. Smith would take the higher target first. Climbing used less fuel than descending rapidly, but the higher target was also further north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the airfields. If Smith made the wrong choice, one bomber would get through, and the entire mission would be considered a failure. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet at 0023 hours. Porter locked on to the third contact. Range, 7 miles. Heading, 160. Speed, 190 knots. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys, and it was taking evasive action. Turning, changing altitude. Someone aboard that aircraft knew the Americans had night fighters in the area. The third bomber was a Nakajima K-49, Danyu. The Americans called it Helen. Faster than the Betty. Maximum speed 306 miles per hour. Better defensive armament. 5 7.7 machine guns. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Approaching from dead astern would put Smith in the gunner's sights. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left, the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable. Smith exploited that weakness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The Helen continued its evasive maneuvers, turning left, then right, climbing 200 feet, descending 300. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Random changes in heading and altitude made radar tracking difficult. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements, watching the pattern, anticipating the next turn. Smith closed to 600 yards. The Helen's tail gunner opened fire. Tracers streamed past Smith's canopy. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had seconds to take the shot before the bomber pilot initiated aggressive evasive action. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst, 72 rounds, longer than his previous attacks, necessary because the Helen was maneuvering. The 20mm shells punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away to avoid debris. The burning aircraft fell through 9,000 feet, 8,000, 7,000. It hit the water at 0029 hours. 29 minutes after midnight, 3 bombers down, 9 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed 28%, critical level. Most pilots returned to base at 30% fuel. Below that, any delay could result in a forced landing, or worse. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope, the 4th target, heading 170, altitude 4,000 feet. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfields, thin beams of white light sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets. Smith descended toward the 4th bomber, diving conserved fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. Smith leveled off at 4,200 feet, slightly above the target. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. He could dive on the bomber from above, use gravity to increase his speed, reduce the time the target had to react. Range 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. Smith acquired the target visually at 1 mile, another Betty. The bomber was flying straight toward Mindoro, no evasive action. The pilot either didn't know Japanese bombers were in the area or didn't care. Perhaps he believed his mission was more important than his survival. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill, below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter, 512 rounds remaining, enough for 3 more attacks, maybe 4 if he was conservative. But this was the 4th target. He needed to make every shot count. Smith's fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety margins. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. One chance, one burst. Then he had to return to base, whether the bomber was destroyed or still flying. Smith fired at 0034 hours, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The 20mm shells converged on the Betty's center fuselage. The port wing separated from the aircraft. Fuel tanks ruptured. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. The Betty rolled left and dove toward the ocean. It impacted at 0035 hours, 35 minutes after midnight. 4 bombers destroyed in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. The mathematical calculation was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. At cruise speed, he could fly for another 36 minutes, more than enough to reach the airfield. Unless something went wrong. Porter scanned his radar scope for additional contacts. Nothing. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve was irrelevant. The mission was accomplished. 4 kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. The Lingayen Gulf invasion schedule remained intact. But Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042 hours, Porter detected a new contact, heading north, range 4 miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfields Smith had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much. Smith might not make it back to base. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. Porter called vectors. The range closed rapidly. 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile. Smith acquired the target visually at 800 yards. It wasn't a bomber. It was a Nakajima Ki-84, Hayate. The Americans called it Frank, a single-engine fighter, maximum speed 392 miles per hour, 4 12.7mm machine guns, 2 20mm cannons. One of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61. More maneuverable, better rate of climb. In daylight, a skilled Frank pilot could outfight a Black Widow. But this wasn't daylight, and the Frank pilot had no radar. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith had one advantage. The Frank pilot didn't know Smith was there. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill. But fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit, and the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have time for a second attempt. He would have to disengage immediately and hope he had enough fuel to reach McGuire Field. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. The mathematics were clear. Engaging the fighter would drop his fuel to 15%, below minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The P-61's engines hummed steadily at 320 miles per hour. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. Smith made his decision at 0045 hours. This wasn't tactics anymore. This was responsibility. If he let this aircraft slip through, someone on the ground would die. He squeezed the trigger. 3-second burst. 72 rounds, the longest burst of the night. The shells tore through the Frank's tail section and engine cowling. The Frank's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The fighter rolled right and dove. Smith watched it descend through 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith saw the parachute open, a white canopy against black sky. The Frank continued its dive and hit the water at 0046 hours. Smith checked his fuel gauge. 15%. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%, 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots, easy to miss in darkness. Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%, 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings, that provided 18 minutes of flight time, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. Porter guided Smith toward Mindoro using radar navigation. The island appeared on the scope as a large landmass. McGuire Field was on inland, approximately 1 mile from the beach. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle or construction areas or coral reefs. At 0058 hours, Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine cowling, nose wheel in the forward fuselage. The P-61's landing gear was robust, designed to handle rough airfields. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard, collapse the gear. The aircraft would cartwheel. At 120 miles per hour, the crew would not survive. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%, 36 gallons, 5 minutes remaining. He extended flaps to full. The P-61's airspeed decreased to 110 knots. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, 200, 150. Smith couldn't see the ground. No lights, no visual references, just instruments and the hope that his navigation was correct. At 100 feet altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. 75 feet, 50 feet, 25 feet. Smith prepared for touchdown. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. The P-61's main wheels hit crushed coral at 0059 hours. The impact was harder than normal. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly. 100 knots, 80, 60, 40. The aircraft slowed to taxi speed at 20 knots. Smith couldn't see where he was on the runway. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%, 29 gallons, 3 minutes of fuel remaining. Ground crew arrived with flashlights. They guided Smith to the parking area. The P-61's engine shut down at 0103 hours, 1 hour and 3 minutes after takeoff. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were stiff. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion. 5 intercepts, 5 kills, 1 blind landing, all in 63 minutes of combat. Porter climbed out from the radar operator's compartment. He had tracked 5 targets successfully, vectored Smith to each intercept, maintained radar contact throughout the engagement. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort, pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. History barely recorded what happened next, but its meaning lasted far longer than the night itself. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, please like, subscribe, and comment. Your voice keeps their legacy alive. What Smith and Porter accomplished that night wasn't just about numbers. 5 kills, 1 blind landing, mission accomplished. It was about something deeper. For thousands of years, darkness had been humanity's greatest equalizer in warfare. Night rendered the strongest army blind, the fastest aircraft useless, the most skilled pilot helpless. Darkness made every combatant equal. The P-61 Black Widow changed that equation forever. Radar didn't just give Smith an advantage, it fundamentally transformed what night combat meant. Before the Black Widow, night fighting was defensive, hiding in darkness, hoping to survive until dawn. After the Black Widow, night fighting became offensive, hunting in darkness, turning the enemy's sanctuary into a killing ground. The Japanese bombers that approached Mindoro on December 29, 1945, believed darkness protected them. They were wrong. The doctrine that had governed warfare for millennia, that night belonged to no one, was obsolete. Smith proved that night could be dominated, controlled, weaponized. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron scored 18 total kills during World War II. Smith's 5 kills on December 29-30th accounted for 28% of the squadron's entire war record. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that single night total. But the real significance wasn't Smith's personal achievement. It was what his mission demonstrated about the future of warfare. Technology had always shaped combat, but radar represented something different. It didn't make weapons more powerful, or faster, or more destructive. It made the invisible visible. It turned uncertainty into certainty. It gave one side omniscience while the other remained blind. That asymmetry, knowing everything while your enemy knows nothing, would define military conflicts for the next 80 years. McNair Field supported the Lingayen Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Mindoro provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended enabled that air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion would have been delayed, casualties would have mounted, the war would have lasted longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives, unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 700 aircraft built, used in every theater: Europe, Pacific, China, Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1954, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944 over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world, and Carroll Smith was the best pilot flying it. What Smith proved that night transcends any single mission or any single war. He proved that darkness, humanity's oldest, most reliable sanctuary, could be conquered, that technology could rewrite the fundamental rules of combat, that the impossible yesterday becomes the routine tomorrow. Every night fighter pilot who followed Smith, every radar operator who guided missiles through darkness, every stealth aircraft that turned invisibility into a weapon, they all inherited the lesson Smith wrote in the skies above Mindoro. Darkness